Hello and welcome to the Mayhem Lab. Today we're going to be talking about routers and open source router firmware and some of the interesting changes that have been going on in that realm. Alright, so we're back. We're talking about routers today. Michael and I, as you probably know, spend a lot of time playing with hacking routers in the Mini Pointer project and things like that. And really it's interesting because all of those projects really are possible because of open source router firmware. Some years ago, I don't know how many years ago, someone came up with the original OpenWrt and DDWrt. Those are Linux-based firmware for routers. The reason they're called the Wrt, OpenWrt or DDWrt, is because they were originally built for these Linksys-style routers that were, their model number used to be WRT. I think they stood for wireless router.
Sounds right.
Kind of started with this specific model of router. The open source software was named after that, but very quickly the open source software spread beyond the Linksys routers to lots of different models of routers. These are two different TP-Link routers.
Yeah, TP-Link seems to be very popular. If you look at, specifically I'm thinking of OpenWrt website. I don't use DD as much. It's still a good product, but I'm more of a fan of OpenWrt. If you look at their website, they have a list of compatible routers. It seems to be, at least in my opinion, fairly heavy on TP-Link.
Yeah, like almost all the TP-Link routers work very well with OpenWrt because of the chipsets they use inside, and for other reasons too. It's interesting because TP-Link, when they deploy their routers up to recently, they deployed their routers with their own firmware on it, but without any protections to prevent you from uploading like signed firmware or anything to prevent you from uploading other firmware to the web interface. And also, by and large, their routers have a serial interface, and if you connect to the serial interface, there's no password, or the password's well known. So you can hack these pretty easily, which is really nice. Well, I say up until recently, kind of the main thing we want to talk about here in the show today is some interesting things have been happening. Last year, we heard that the FCC put out a paper or a direction for router manufacturers that they had to stop doing that. They had to stop allowing people to put other firmware on devices. And the reasoning for that was that this device is a transmitter, and TP-Link, to save money, is going to put one chip on it and then in software configure it to use certain frequency bands in the United States and sell it there, use different frequency bands in other countries and sell it there. And with the open source software, open source firmware, I could change the frequency band. So whereas I'm only supposed to run this on channels 1.6 through an 11 typically here in the United States, I could actually use another channel above that nobody else is using because it's illegal, thinking I'd get better performance or more open bandwidth or something. But again, that's illegal because that band is specified for something else. And the unfortunate thing, when the FCC first put that guidance out, I think the people maybe who did it weren't as technical because their direction wasn't find ways to keep it from interfering. Their direction was prevent people from putting open source software on the router,
right.
Which would suck for us. We can't do any of our fun router hacking anymore. We couldn't build mini pointers anymore and things like that. Luckily, and this always.
But yeah, so as Kevin was saying, recently it sounds like they've changed their mind, or they've come out with a new stance.
So it was interesting. So they put out that first guideline, and the industry and people like us had a pretty swift and strong backlash in terms of, that's not the only way you can fix it, and can you give more clarification, and this just is a problem. And it was kind of nice because the FCC actually took that feedback and came back this year now trying to clarify, saying, no, we weren't saying you had to prevent people from customizing the firmware. They backed off to a more reasonable stance, which was you have to prevent people from somehow being able to change those settings, being able to choose frequency bands that are out of certain things. Or actually, very specifically, one thing that we've learned recently is they actually told us now that one of their biggest challenges is these new 5 gigahertz routers that are for like 802.11ac, runs on 5 gigahertz, and NCAN.
NCAN, yes.
In that 5 gigahertz range, you're supposed to use, it's supposed to by default have DFS, dynamic frequency selection. And what that does is looks if there's other uses of that bandwidth in the area, and a common use apparently is Doppler weather radar. So your router is supposed to detect if that's going on, and if it is, the router is supposed to avoid using those channels and just use other channels. And that's the default configuration on these devices. But some of the open source software like DDWord can actually disable that. So one of the things the FCC has recently come out with is apparently as of June 2nd of this year, 5 gigahertz routers can't allow people to disable DFS. So they very specifically said, okay, that's the specific problem that we need to target in the short term. Unfortunately, a lot of router manufacturers, we're seeing TP-Link do this. The easiest, cheapest way to do that still is to lock us out of the firmware,
Right.
to set a password on the serial interface that we would never know, to make it impossible to upload firmware to the router that isn't signed by TP-Link or something like that. So we actually have seen some news articles. I actually got a router in February from TP-Link that I couldn't upload firmware to the first time I tried, couldn't upload OpenWrt to the first time I tried, and it turned out that was because they had put that protection on. Now
that was specifically a home-based.
Yeah, it was a bigger one than
It's
this,
a
but
bigger
the same
router.
thing.
We have not yet seen that issue with the smaller portable routers,
Oh, good.
the MR series.
Yep.
Because I've now gotten, we're still obviously building the mini poners. We've gotten some in with the 2.4 revision of the firmware
Okay.
that they're packaged with now, and I haven't had any issues.
Okay.
So
Yeah, and the interesting about the home router, it was a AC 1700, I think, model router, Archer A7 or something like that. I was able to find out online that while I couldn't put OpenWrt directly on it, I could put an older version of the firmware for that router on it, which didn't have those protections, and then put OpenWrt on it. So I was able to bypass that protection, and hopefully, we're hoping, or at least I'm hoping, that the router manufacturer will kind of continue that model where they're going to work to comply with the requirements by making it non-trivial to upload new firmware, but hopefully, and it's not easy to make it impossible to not upload new firmware.
right.
So we're hoping if they continue to just make it non-trivial but not impossible, we'll still find ways to do it. So we can still kind of play with that.
Yeah, so I think I'm really glad. Let me start over. I was really disappointed last year when it came out because I thought, well, gee, there's the end of our hobby of building mini poners and hacking routers. But I'm very happy to see that they've kind of changed direction and not necessarily done a 180 on it, but they've gotten more granular on what exactly the issue is and tried to prevent that specific issue versus just saying you can't upload firmware to your routers, which I thought was just sort of ridiculous.
Yeah.
So,
And actually, we just saw a promising news article this week that Linksys, it's actually Belkin now, I believe, owns Linksys, but they've committed that their newer models of the Blue WRT routers will continue to support open source. Not all their router lines, but this specific kind of their high-end line will. And the way they're going to do that is instead of locking people out of the ability to overwrite the firmware, they're actually moving those few settings that you have to kind of burn in for a certain region, like what channels you can use and things like being able to DFS. They're moving that out of the firmware, out of the kind of user-controlled memory spaces that we can override into some other area of the router that's static. So that's kind of cool. It's a more expensive way. It's going to require
Right.
more components and different models for different regions with different hardware potentially, or at least kind of statically coding that on there. But they made that commitment. It's obviously going to be on their kind of more expensive routers. I buy
Sure.
TP-Links because they're cheap.
Right.
I know these can get kind of expensive, but it's still nice to see a company that said there's not only one way to do it, and we're going to do it the way to support the open source community. So good for them.
Yeah, which is awesome. So another nice plug for Linksys.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, we'll definitely be looking at those routers when they come out and seeing how difficult it is to still upload that that firmware, and see if we can. I don't want to say reverse engineer it, but I'd be curious to see where they're storing those settings and how locked down that is. I mean, what are they doing? Is it truly burned into a chip and then they're manufacturing different routers for different regions?
Yeah.
I'd just be kind of curious to find out more.
Yep.
So yeah, I just wanted to kind of bring that out and talk about it a little bit, and I think that's pretty much that what we're going to talk about for this show. So thanks for joining us.
See you again soon.
We'll see you later.
Thanks.